Hello everyone, it's Amazing Grace. I've, as you can tell, been doing some research on some renewable energy sources. My last video mentioned it briefly at the end, and that took me down a little avenue of some more detail about these things. So in particular today, as you can see, wind turbines. I'm just going to throw some information at you that I've discovered. I try and keep it as easy to understand as possible. As I look through some information about these turbines, I, as usual, was discovering more questions and answers and some really interesting conclusions. And I think you might be surprised if it's not something you've looked at yourself. You might actually be quite surprised by some of the information I raise here. So just looking at a few websites I've done, I bounced around a bit. I've looked at what generally is said about them, and I've kind of just picked out some sites that will just literally have it written down for you to refer to. Go ahead and find out this information yourself, check against what I'm telling you. There may be some slight variations in figures and so forth, but I'm just kind of trying to generally give you the lowdown on it, really. So there may be, like I say, some differences depending on what sources you go to. But generally speaking, I just wanted to highlight the fact that when you create a wind turbine farm, you have quite a lot of overheads, obviously, like with most things. So I was interested in what they may be, because I felt that the amount of energy that these wind turbines produced would probably fluctuate, and therefore that would determine how much money and profit they would make from the turbines, and also if the overheads are quite large, how these turbines made money, because they're popping up everywhere. So some of the costs related to wind turbine farms are just the general stuff. So listed here, for instance, as you would guess, insurance, your maintenance costs and repairs, spare parts, and obviously the admin costs. Nothing unusual about that. Also, it says that as the turbines get older, costs for repair and spare parts start increasing over time. Again, that's probably quite normal. And generally, their life expectancy is about 20 years for a turbine. That I thought was quite interesting, because I don't know if any of you have ever invested in solar panels or your own wind turbine. I haven't in particular, but I know people that have. And usually what happens when you get sold them, or you look at the financial implications of buying them, you look to see how long generally it will take you to gain back the money that it cost you to buy them in the first place. So of course this is the same with wind farms. How long would it take for a company who was erecting these wind farms to gain back the money that it cost them to put them up in the first place? So let's have a look at those figures, shall we? So bear with me, this is quite a detailed website breaking down into equations. We're not going to go through the equations. I'm going to just generally summarize it for you. So in this instance, this is America. We're talking about wind farms in America. And the guy that has done these calculations has taken averages of the amount of energy produced, the average cost of one of these turbines, the average wind speed, that kind of thing, for the country, and then put them into these equations. He's given definitions of what all the terms mean in this equation. This equation is for calculating profitability, or the cost to generate power with a wind turbine or farm. And I think what he's done is he's done it on merit that it's just one turbine. So he's taken an average turbine and the money it makes and how long it takes to earn enough money to cover the cost, to break even basically for buying the turbine in the first place. So he goes through the equations, and for instance here, operation costs and land lease costs and things like that, and then going through that he finds out the results. So his total annual expense for a particular turbine, an average turbine in America, is $187,902, and the gross income is $245,980. So the annual profit from the turbine was $58,079, which is a 4.47% profit, or ROI, which means return on investment. which is, as he states here, is relatively low. So most companies generally would expect an 8% or higher to invest in an idea or product to make it worth their while to put money into something. Now, at that percentage, they would take, and this is the crux of it really, is what I'm getting to, it would take more than 22 years to pay for the wind turbine. Well, as we saw earlier, and as it states here, the product life of a turbine is 20 years. Now, I think if I go back, I'm not sure if he included how some of those expenses will increase as the wind turbine gets older. So as I'm looking at these figures, and I was literally just out of interest trying to find out, what made these farms such an appealing thing for businesses or companies to produce. What is the incentive? And I look at these figures on average for America and think, gosh, well, there is no incentive. Well, that is a gamble, if anything. So need to look at it a bit further. So I found a guy called Eric Rosenblum, who is an advocate for alternative energy. Actually, Alternative World Energy Outlook is the actual group that he's involved in, which I believe he set up himself. It's independent of energy firms or government or anything like that, self-funded. And he wrote some interesting articles, and in amongst those, I'll just show you a few here. So this is about the organisation, aweo.org, Alternative World Energy Outlook. You can go along and just type that in and you'll come up with all these pages that I'm going to show you. Is that wind farms actually, as well as the data that I've just shown you with regard to how much money they make, they actually don't always run continuously. So a wind turbine, when it's not windy, you would think sit there idly. Well, actually, if the weather's cold, then they have to keep their blades running. They have heaters also. So I looked at what the costs involved are in running the actual turbine. And in amongst this, so for instance, you have a yaw mechanism, which is basically what turns the whole blade system towards the wind. You have the blade pitch control, keeps the rotor spinning at a regular rate, lights, controllers, sensors, all that stuff, data collection. You have to heat the blades if it is cold. You have to dehumidify the nacelle. You have to have heating and pumps and coolers and hydraulics and a magnet and generator as a motor and all sorts of stuff. Now those things, if the electricity that they're producing is minimal, those power needs come from the grid. So to run a wind turbine, you have to be connected to the grid and you consume energy to produce energy. So he uses an example here. So if the plant as a whole, which may produce only 25% of its rated capacity a year, and I think some of the other ones I've seen, depending on, here in England, we have quite high wind rates. So in America, I think our production rate is something like 60% generally. It's a decent rate. In America, obviously, in certain areas, it's going to be a lot less than that. We are known for being quite windy. So say it only produces 25% of its rated capacity annually, and this is not every year. This is saying on a particularly bad year or a particularly, low year, not maybe its worst year, it would actually require more energy than it would be producing. So it would be using twice as much energy than it produces and sells. And a very good point about this is it's like taking dirty energy in, so your fossil fuel energy from your national grid, and then returning it as clean energy. Is that such a big leap? And then, of course, charging more for it, saying that it comes from a wind farm, when actually what you've been doing is turning the turbine with General Electric or your national grid and running all of these parts of the turbine from that system. So if you're not creating that energy, those things still need to work because wind can pick up at any time. A lot of the time the rotors have to be idling. You can see them sometimes, they're just ticking over, and there's actually been a few protests about the very fact that these wind turbines are run when they're not actually taking in any energy. So how do they get away with this? How is this even even possible? Well, if you're not making any money off of it and you're taking from the grid, then this would surely be declared. I mean, we would see it written down that actually, on paper, this is not really green energy. Well, in actual fact, they don't actually declare always what energy they're using. A lot of the financial stuff that comes up won't even declare it. They're not even mentioning that energy is being drawn into running the turbine. So you won't find that being offset against the energy it produces. Also, surprisingly, in America, there's huge tax breaks and subsidies for wind energy, which the general taxpayer, obviously not here in England in this instance, but in America, they're the ones that are paying for. So without focusing too much on America, as lovely as you all are if you're listening, I looked at this guy, Eric Rosenblum. He had written a book called A Problem with Wind Power, and I scanned through it, and yeah, a lot of it was about environmental issues, the effect on nature and animal life and all that, which is all really legitimate arguments. And turning my attention to the UK, he quotes a guy down here called Ray Berry and something he'd written here, an article he'd written, and I went and had a look at this guy myself and came across something he'd written here on a site called Wind Farm Action. This is set in the Highlands and around. They cover lots of other areas, but he's obviously from Scotland. And he mentions, going back to the subsidiaries that you get and the incentives that you get in America to build wind farms, he goes back to something called the Renewable Obligation Certificates, which is what we do here in the UK. So let's take a little bit of time to understand what they are. So wind turbines, because their output is intermittent, as he states here, and unreliable, he and others were asking why people would spend so much on these huge turbines. And as I've already shown you the figures, they don't return profit to you. They take far too long to make any money. Most of the time, the turbine might reach the end of its life before you've broken even. So in the actual turbine farm, if you were to just run it, you wouldn't make any money from it. And so obviously in America, all the handouts they get given is an incentive. And so here in the UK, we have something called ROCs. And this is where the incentive comes in. So they're certificates. And when you put up a wind farm, you actually have people invest in wind farms, okay? So you wouldn't get the General Joe blogs come up and just build a wind farm. And this guy argues that the wind farm actually has two products that it sells. One is the electricity, which it sells back to the national grid. Here in England is probably better than it is in America because we are windy here. Again, they do still need to use energy from the national grid if there is no wind or it gets particularly cold, and just running the actual wind turbine takes energy. But there's a second product that is sold, and that is these ROCs, these certificates. And they have a value of their own. So the government wants to increase the use for renewable energy and renewable energy being generated. Okay, so anyone producing non-renewable energy sources like coal and gas are obliged now to supply 3% of all the energy that they produce from a renewable source. So they buy a wind farm or a hydro dam or something, and just, it has to constitute 3% of their sales. So if you go to any energy company, 3% of their sales by law have to come from a renewable source. Most of the time, as it says here, it doesn't come close to that, and then they get fined. They get fined per kilowatt. But the way around it is to buy ROCs from renewable energy producers to the amount of the megawatts that they're short. So every time someone from a wind farm who owns a wind farm produces 1 megawatt of energy, they receive an ROC, which is one of these certificates. They can then sell that to a company that is a producer of coal or gas, who would also own possibly a wind farm, but that would not be producing enough to cover the 3% of their legal obligation. So they would go to, like I say, a wind farm, buy these certificates off of them, and then that would count towards their production of green energy. So, for instance, someone on a wind farm who's producing energy, wind energy, and they're producing, say, it's £30 per megawatt they're charging for, or they're getting profit, £30 profit per megawatt. They then can sell their ROCs, and they work out at about £67 per megawatt. So they're actually worth more than the energy per megawatt, more than double. So they end up making £100 per megawatt instead of the 30 that it would have originally been making them, because they then sell that certificate for that megawatt to another company. And I know they're doing it because I found some accounts from a company. This is from Skirra Offshore Energy. They actually supply energy from not too far from where I live. And in their statement, their financial report statement for 2017, they state here that revenue is measured from generation of electricity from wind turbines and from green certificates, renewable obligation certificates, granted to the company and then recognised with income as eligible electricity generated. And so when you go up to their financial report and they say here, revenue, that you can pretty much guarantee 2/3 of that has come from these ROCs, not the amount of electricity they're producing. So you can imagine that they don't actually have to have these turbines working very well. It doesn't matter that they're producing a lot of green energy, because they make triple the stated amount per kilowatt or per megawatt of energy by selling back those certificates. So this, combined with the energy that they're taking from the national grid at quiet times and then converting it back out after running the wind turbine into green energy and then receiving a certificate for doing so, selling back to a company who's not producing green energy in order for them to continue selling non-green fuel, coal, gas, whatever. It's a right operation, a really interesting operation. So, although I've tried to keep the detail minimal for you because it can be quite a bit of a headache, to be fair, I hope I've made it clear enough for you to understand that there are loopholes in this system, that what you're sold is not always what it appears to be. And of course, business, and when there's money to be made, it's very, very rare that it's being done for your benefit. There is always money changing hands. There is always profit to be made. And it's very unlikely that it's done in order to save you money. In actual fact, green energy, as you know, when you buy it, costs a lot more when they're making a huge amount of money for doing nothing. So there's the incentive for wind turbines, at least. I'm not sure I'll go into the other sources of energy, maybe not. So thank you for tuning in. I hope you discovered something interesting from that. And stay tuned, because I have a lot more information to share with you at a later date. Okay, take care, everybody. God bless you all. Bye-bye.